Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Peace and blessings. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, I have the honor of introducing our ICSC spokesperson, Sister Hadab Tarifi, who will give opening remarks, inshallah. And please make sure to write down your questions in the question and answer chat box. So go ahead, Sister Hadab.
Thank you so much for joining this series with the current situation in the Middle East, in Palestine, and specifically in Gaza. We have been honored to have Dr. Mahmood Ibrahim give us of his time and knowledge to touch on the history of Palestine. The last two sessions, Dr. Ibrahim gave us quite an educational presentation about Palestine. He was very generous to be willing to give us another session specifically on Gaza. With everything happening in Gaza, it was important to understand the history, what has been happening. And for us, normal people who on a daily basis, we witness the genocide in Gaza, it's important for us to be equipped with the information and the knowledge that will allow us to engage others so that the history is not lost and the people of Palestine and specifically Gaza have someone to speak on their behalf and tell the truth that is sadly not told. Most of the world didn't even know where Gaza is. Now they do, but that doesn't mean that they know much about the history. So we're honored to have Dr. Mahmood Ibrahim with us. Dr. Mahmood, until recently, was the professor of history at Cal Poly Pomona. He actually served as the chair of the history department for 2 terms, and he was awarded the Hart Award for Outstanding Faculty Leadership in 2017. Many don't know, but Dr. Ibrahim is actually born as a refugee in the West Bank town of Ramallah, a few months after the Nakba, when his family and the whole village of Jimzo were driven out by the Zionist militias after the July 11th, 1948. So Dr. Ibrahim immigrated to the United States in 1996 and lived in New York City's Lower East Side. He received his BA from the City College of New York, and then he moved to Los Angeles and attended UCLA, from which he received his master's degree in 1974 and PhD degree in 1981. And as a scholar of the Middle Eastern study, he was awarded several Fulbright grants and National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship to conduct research in Cairo and Damascus. He participated in several summer seminars funded by the National Endowment, where one of them was the Islamic Studies at Columbia University, Just War and Jihad at Rutgers University, and at St. Francis of Assisi in his time in Italy. Dr. Ibrahim taught as a visiting lecturer at UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, UC Riverside. You covered all Southern California, Dr. Ibrahim, but also he went to Bill Gates University, where he became chair of the Department of History. We are honored to have Dr. Ibrahim with us for a third session, specifically on Gaza. The ground is yours, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here again to talk about this very important issue. I want to connect to the last hour. I had discussed the 1973 war and the subsequent disengagement agreements that then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger negotiated between Egypt and Israel. The purpose of that particular disengagement agreement was really to remove Egypt from the theater of war. And eventually succeeded, especially because of the Camp David agreement. Egypt was out of the conflict, which from that time onward, it begins to be an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's no longer an Arab-Israeli conflict. Although the Arab people continue to support and engage with Palestine, the governments themselves don't. And as such, the conflict increasingly became between Israel and its attack on the Palestinians in the continuation of the assault on the people as well as the land of Palestine. What has happened, a couple of important developments took place after the 1967-73 wars, and that is the decline of Pan-Arabism, the ideology that was really pushed by President Nasser, and Arab nationalism as a whole, or Pan-Arabism, was slowly replaced by state nationalism. And state nationalism here, I mean that each one of these states began to look for its own concerns. And that was aided specifically after the 1973 oil embargo and the huge amount of wealth that was generated to the treasuries of especially Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. And they began to jealously guard their own wealth, so to speak, for themselves. And that promoted, and with the Egypt signing the Camp David agreement, that promoted this idea of statism or state nationalism, if you want. To replace that, for the Palestinians, Palestinian nationalism, I mentioned, was really subdued in the context of Arab nationalism. And so when the decline of Arab nationalism, Palestinian nationalism emerges and begins to solidify, especially after 1968 and the formation of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. And eventually, subsequently, the PLO begins to represent the Palestinian people in general, with the various factions, resistance factions, such as the newly founded or reformulated Arab nationalist movement into the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and eventually the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and a few other groups, resistance groups that were part of the unions that represented the peasantry, that represent the workers, and other functions within Palestine. So the PLO really began to represent the Palestinian aspiration. And eventually, of course, by 1974, 1975, the Arab governments themselves recognized that the PLO is the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And so you can see increasingly it was the Palestinians who are going to carry out and carry on this struggle vis-a-vis Israel. Now, the Camp David agreement that was signed by 1981 or so, by 1982, Israel felt confident enough to begin to implement and interpret the agreement in its own way. And they tried to create alternative institutions, especially under the premiership of Menachem Begin, institutions that would supplant or take place of the PLO. There's something called the village leagues, where the Israel will continue to control the land and the people, but some municipalities will take care of some of the work that a municipality would undertake. The disengagement agreement also gave Israel the chance and the freedom to strike at any other Arab country that might threaten its quote unquote security. And they bombed the Ozira nuclear research facility in Iraq. And by 1978, they invaded South Lebanon. And that would be the first of a couple of invasions of South Lebanon. And that is to basically strike at the Palestinian resistance that were beginning to concentrate their activities in that area. The other important development that took place as a result of 67 and 73 is the decline of nationalist ideology, if you want, and the decline of socialist ideologies in the Arab world. And at that time, the re-emergence, if you want, of Islamism, Islam as a factor of organization, Islam as a factor of basis of resistance, Islamism, the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been suppressed throughout the late 50s and the 60s, especially under the rule of Jamal Abdel Nasser, re-emerged in Egypt and began to solidify its position in the in Egyptian society, and of course to renew its contacts in various branches that that had come into the Arab world. So these two are important as transformations that took place as a result of the war. Of course, Islamism as a mode of resistance, Islamism as a way of organization would be cemented after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. It succeeded in toppling the rule of the Shah of Iran, and as a mode of organization, it proved successful, and it began to be looked at also as a model. And so this is an important aspect of the transformations of the region in the 1970s. And so in the, sharing my screen here with you, so I mentioned the invasion of Lebanon in 1978, but the really second invasion was in 1982, in September of 1982, which ostensibly was to push out the Palestinian resistance of South Lebanon, but at that time, the defense minister, Sharon, continued his push into South Lebanon all the way to Beirut, and eventually allowing the Phalangist militias, the militias that had been aligned and allied with Israel, to enter the camps of Sabra and Shatila and perpetrate a horrendous massacre against a defenseless Palestinian population, because at that time, the United States and Lebanon and the various Arab governments agreed that the PLO should evacuate Beirut altogether, which eventually they did, and relocated themselves into Tunisia. And so the Palestinian population in Lebanon was left defenseless, and allowing Israel and the Phalange militias to perpetrate that massacre. Now, in the meanwhile, the Israelis began to implement what is known as the Iron Fist policy. Once again, the civil authority or the village leagues that were proposed in the early 80s proved to be a failure. The mayors of Ramallah, Nablus, Hebron Jericho, the various important cities began to lead the local population, and indeed the Israeli either whether it's conspiracy individuals or certainly would be allowed by the state had attacked these mayors and several bombing. Bassam al-Shaqqa, for example, the mayor of Nablus, lost his legs. Few other people were also maimed by these car bombs that were placed surreptitiously. And indeed, this attack was really to cow down, so to speak, the Palestinian population, which increased its resistance, especially now that PLO has been removed somewhat geographically into Beirut. From Beirut, the people began to take up the resistance, and in the face of that, the Israelis came down with an iron fist policy, really brutal suppression of these nationalist sentiments. I happened to go to Birzeit University in 1985, and that is what the height of the iron fist policy. Demonstrations were being suppressed, people being arrested, people being killed in the streets, students. Some of my students were killed in demonstrations. So much so that by 1987, December, coming into 1988, we have what is known as the first Intifada, the first uprising. And of course, this uprising started in Gaza and then eventually spread to the West Bank. And so you can imagine that Gaza was really being repressed. At the time, there were like 5,000 settlers spread out in certain, on the coast, Gosh Katif, they called it. These 5,000 settlers were taking the territory and the place of more than half. And indeed, the idea that these 5,000 settlers need to move back and forth in peace meant that whole thoroughfares were being bulldozed. So Gaza was really under a triple iron fist policy. And the more repression, of course, the greater the uprising. And indeed, by December 9th, 1987, the explosion of the people in the first Intifada that continued all the way until, of course, that brings in the Gulf War, 1990-91, which was another vicious attack against the Palestinians when they were prevented from moving about, and they were really brutally put down. So I mentioned how the 1973 allowed for the reemergence of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Intifada at the time was an impromptu leadership that emerged as an ad hoc committee, came to be known as the Underground Unified Leadership of the Intifada, which really was a representative of the various social forces, political forces, resistance forces, if you want, in the West Bank and Gaza, so that they will lead this ad hoc uprising that came to be known as the Intifada. A few months after that, the constitution of Hamas emerged, and that again was in Gaza, and Hamas began to be on the same level in Gaza as the unified leadership of the uprising in the West Bank. And so indeed, this is the start of this organization that we know as Hamas in response to the conditions that had been created and by the Israeli occupation. Remember, the settlers were really a big factor in the suppression and the iron fist policy that was instituted on in Gaza. So Gaza, now I'm going to give you a little bit background to the area of Gaza. And from the maps that we saw earlier, you can see that it is really at the corner of Southwest Asia, right by, if you want, Africa. So, because the Sinai Peninsula has always been considered part of Africa. And so it's the gateway to Africa if you are coming from Asia, or the gateway to Asia if you're coming from Africa. And so Gaza, as a city, its history goes way back to the Bronze Age. That is 5,000 years ago. There is a Tel II, that was inhabited, and excavations, of course, you can tell, is not really as free as it can be. And the present city of Gaza is largely built upon the areas that had been inhabited in the past. But certainly, certain information and certain records, historical records, point to the area being inhabited, as I said, 5,000 years ago. And if you project the civilization that began to emerge in the region of the Near East. By the way, the Near East is a term that referred to British interests, and that included Afghanistan, Turkey, Greece, Macedonia, Egypt, and the areas, Iran. And so that was to the British called the Near East. The term Middle East emerged after the Cold War and after the Egyptian Suez Canal, specifically conflict, when the British and the French had lost their influence in the region, and the Middle East began to emerge as a term reflecting actually American interest, if you want. And so whether you call the Near East or the Middle East, Asharq al-Awsat in Arabic, the Middle East, you're referring to this greater region. So Gaza is the knot that connects east, the Levant, and therefore the civilizations that grew in the area, Mesopotamia, Babylonia, Assyria, the Phoenicians. All of these civilizations will emerge much later. But the earliest of civilization, of course, was the Egyptians, the pharaonic Egyptian civilization. And there are records from going back to Thutmose III, for example, indicate that Gaza was an outpost for the Egyptians to trade with the local population as well as the trade that is coming in from further east. And so if Gaza is right there, maybe I'll have this map right there. It is the port, so to speak, for any goods that are coming in from the east, this easterly direction. And more specifically, if you want, it became a port in the 1st century BCE and continued to be a port, but specifically for the Nabateans, who were in Petra, in the area of southern Jordan, right there, where I am making this cross here. And of course, that also means that the trade caravans that we know that came from all the way from Yemen at the time of Ma'in, at the time of Saba, that is, 1000 BCE, like 3000 years ago, they used to come up through the Hijaz or through the Red Sea into the port of Ayla, which is now Aqaba, and then also move on to Gaza, and from there to the Eastern Mediterranean. So it was very an important strategic location that was it needed to be controlled by any emerging power or any invading power, whether it is going east or going into Egypt. So there are the different periods, whether it's a Bronze Age, the Egyptian civilization, or the Assyrians in the 8th century, 7th century BCE, when they emerged also and they became a regional power. Even at the time of, we have records of it, when Alexander the Macedonian invaded the Near East, and in his push southward, had to contend with Gaza, because Gaza again has a defensive encampment, and it needs to be controlled, so to speak, for the further drive south. Apparently, Gaza was able to resist Alexander for at least 2 months before the town was overtaken. And the Macedonian occupation eventually led to, and Alexander died there shortly thereafter, and his kingdom that he had created through his whirlwind conquest was divided between his generals. The Seleucids, Seleuciyin in Arabic, were established in Antioch in northern Syria, Antakya today. And another general, Ptolemy, was based in Egypt. And so those two actually also had conflicts amongst themselves. And Gaza would be occupied alternately by one or the other. Nonetheless, Greek culture seems to have been established there. Gaza eventually became a polis, that means a city-state, that it had its own government, ruled by a senate, about 500 people, and the Hellenistic states eventually would lead to the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire sometime around the middle of the 1st century BCE conquered the region after Antony and Cleopatra's famous popular knowledge. They take over the region, and Gaza actually begins to prosper and become stable during the Roman period, and more specifically because the Roman Empire itself, for several hundred years, was strong, and indeed Gaza benefited from the stability. And in the 1st century of the Common Era, Christianity begins to develop there. Eventually, churches were built, monasteries were built, and there are records of monastic existence and industry that went along with monasticism. And so Gaza is really an ancient town that went through so many iterations and so many occupations, and eventually from the paganism of the Roman temples and Greek temples of Athena and Apollo and Zeus, more Christians begin or Christianity begins to be adopted more and more. Now we have churches. And so all the way until the 6th century, when Muslim rule comes in, and Islam begins slowly to supplant what has been there before. And actually, we know that the Prophet's father had died in Gaza. And so Gaza was a thriving city in the 6th century in the Common Era because of the caravan route that existed from thousands of years going from Yemen, Saba, and Ma'in all the way through the Hijaz to the port of Ayla. And from there, they would either cross the Sinai or go to Gaza. And so it was very well known to the population of the Arabian Peninsula. Arabs had settled there way back since the Canaanite era, of course, would give into the people more and more who become, quote, the Northern Arabs and eventually the Muslims. Gaza during the Islamic period was part of the Jund of Palestine. And I mentioned the Jund of Palestine earlier on during the Umayyad period as well as the Abbasid period. It will pick up more of a strategic significance during the Ayyubid period. And by the way, the Ayyubid period lasts from the rule of Salah ad-Din, let's say 1171 to about 1260. And it was they who built the Shuja'iyya neighborhood in Gaza. In the Ayyubid dynasty, Salah ad-Din himself had taken over Gaza from the Crusades. Remember, the Crusades were actually trying to not only take the Gaza and the Holy Land, but they, at one particular point, they sailed towards Mecca. And Salah ad-Din was able to do a variety of reforms and variety of maneuvers to be able to block that kind of advance. And Gaza became a strategic significant because of its, once again, its location gave it enhanced further its strategic significance. So the Mamluk period that followed the Ayyubid period is from 1260 to about 1516. That again gave Gaza a great significance because it began to be the connecting point between the Syrian province, which was a whole together one province with sub-districts, of course, and then the Egyptian province that was the seat of the Sultan. And so any movement of troops, any movement of messengers, any movement of commerce, any movement of delegations would cross through Gaza. And so Gaza eventually began to reflect all of these civilizations, all of these governors, if you want. Mamluks had built several madrasas being colleges. I should mention that Gaza was the birthplace of Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, founder of the Shafi'i school of law. You know that Sunni Islam has 4 schools, the Shafi'i being one of them, and he's the one really who solidified the usul or usul al-fiqh, the sources of Islamic law. So it became a very important educational center for Shafi'is. And eventually, by the way, he moved on to Egypt, and there is a great deal of, I think his mausoleum is in part of Cairo. And there was Bimaristan, that is hospitals. And so really it began to reflect all of the Mamluk cities of the region with its madrasas, khans, caravansarais, souks, suwaiqat, you name it. This was basically the way a sultan or a governor would serve the city by establishing waqfs that would support these institutions. And so Gaza reflected that. And indeed, during the reign of the Sultan Muhammad al-Nasr Muhammad ibn Qalawun, Gaza was finally made as part of the governorate of Syria. The governor of Syria is would be based in Damascus, but he had all jurisdiction from Gaza all the way up to Antioch or Antakya. Gaza thrives during the Ottoman period again, once again, because of its location, and also begins to be involved in the re-emergence of local leaderships. This is an era in Ottoman history in 16th and 17th century, basically, and 18th century, when the local families begin to have their quasi-independence, autonomous, but within the umbrella of the Ottoman Sultan. And the Radwan dynasty, as sometimes referred to, would rule Gaza on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan, nonetheless, for much of the 18th century. The 19th century, I should, by the way, if you want, I could mention that the various Arab geographers, Arab travelers, Al-Stakhri, Al-Idrisi, Al-Muqaddasi, Yaqut al-Hamawi, and finally, if you want, Ibn Battuta, all visited the city and all described the city as being prosperous with a lot of population, leafy trees, industry, and so on. And so Gaza would, rise up and down because according to the ruler of the strength of this kind of relationship between the ruling family and the Sultan in Istanbul. So it's a dynamic city nonetheless. And during the 19th century, it was also visited by travelers, whether Europeans or locals, and they described a thriving population. Gaza would be indeed catapulted as a major population center, especially after 1948, when the ethnic cleansing of southern Palestine was instituted by the Zionists, and most of the population from Ascalon, for example, from Caesarea and the areas south of Lud and Ramla would be forced into the Gaza and eventually becomes called the Gaza Strip. And so that particular area, the population at present is about 70%, 75% from the refugees of the 1948 war. And so Gaza, once again, really gets a boost because of the population. To mention how Gaza becomes an entity unto itself, it was supposed to be part of the and there were negotiations, actually, there were agreements that Gaza would be connected with a road between Hebron or the area of the West Bank to Gaza as part of a settlement agreement that never happened because in the 90s, and this is when the push for a settlement of the problem was being conducted with the Madrid conference after the Gulf War. So the 90s brought us the Oslo agreements, the various Oslo agreements, the Paris agreements, this Wye River agreement. There's so many agreements in the negotiations, failed negotiations, even though always the West insisted and Israel insisted that peace can only come through negotiations. And the Palestinians engaged in negotiations ever since 1973 until today. There has not been any fruitful outcome to these negotiations. And as a matter of fact, the middle of in 1995, when Rabin was assassinated, it was specifically because there was a push to settle the issue and cede these conquered territories and form them into the Palestinian state. And when Rabin was assassinated, that brought on Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu's raison d'etre, so to speak, is to oppose peace, is to oppose the establishment of a Palestinian state. And he says that there's no hiding of the fact anymore. He refuses, and he refused in the 1990s to allow for the creation of a Palestinian state, and the assassination of Rabin was the pivotal point for the Israelis to go along with the vision that is articulated by Netanyahu. Of course, that eventually brought on what happened in the Oslo agreement. By the way, there was an agreement to divide Palestine into zones, Zone A, Zone B, Zone C. Let me show you these zones. So Zone A, Area A, is designated as a territory where Israel has exclusive control. Area B is a territory where it is for a joint control. And area and the greater pink area is that for Israel alone. This taken Jerusalem, and the whole area around Jerusalem was already annexed illegally, of course, by Israel. So Gaza was supposed to be part of the Palestinian Authority, and the Oslo Agreement brought us the Palestine Authority. So the Palestine Authority that exists today is really a child of the Oslo, and you can imagine that there are all kinds of limitations on the Palestine Authority. So Gaza as a whole was supposed to be part of the where Palestinians have exclusive control. And you can see how the map made the authority dismembered, disconnected, discontinuous. And so indeed, when we talk about the need for a Palestinian state, we need to talk about a state that is contiguous, that is continuous from one end to another, not separated by roadblocks, not separated by the wall, not separated by Israeli authority that you have to request the permission to cross from one area to another. And indeed, that allowed, to give you a little more, that allowed Israel to increase its settlements in several folds under the guise of the Oslo Agreement, this negotiated agreement that was supposed to bring in the Palestinian state, because they had exclusive authority in those particular areas, and the Palestinian Authority could not do anything about it. So this particular map will show you how now the West Bank is disconnected. Palestinian areas are not contiguous. You can't really travel freely from one area to another. And a wall was being instituted to make sure that the Palestinians are disconnected from one another, disconnected from their schools, disconnected from their health facilities, disconnected, most importantly, from their agricultural land. And of course, you know, the Israelis have certain regulations that if you don't cultivate your area, it's going to be taken away. And of course, you need to have a permit to cultivate that area, and the permit does not come. Just like the houses, you need a permit to build a house, and you know you can wait for years, you're not going to get it. And so when you build a house, the Israelis come in and demolish it. And so the situation really brings us to once back to the Gaza Strip. And as you can see here, there's at least 2.1 million Palestinians in this particular area, a very small area that is, you know, you can drive it in 1 hour. And so the most densely populated areas in the world. And as you know, Israel has waged, you may know, Israel has waged 4 wars, including, and this one will be the 5th, against Gaza since 2005. So what happened to the region, I mean, to Gaza, is the fact that by 2005, the second Intifada, which was an armed Intifada, that started as a result of the provocations of Sharon, who had become a prime minister, and eventually led a huge number of soldiers into the Aqsa Mosque. And as a result of that, and it was, you know, designed provocation, and indeed the second Intifada took place, and that was very, you know, violent Intifada, contrary to the first one. A great many Palestinians were killed. It became the presence of Israeli settlers, as I said, 6,000, no more, became so very untenable, so that they eventually completed their withdrawal from, by September 2005, they withdrew these settlements and destroyed them. Still, you know, people will talk about peace, and indeed, the 2006 legislative elections brought Hamas to victory in Gaza. Hamas was a social organization, had clinics, had schools, had a lot of issues that were meeting the needs of the population, and indeed, they were able, as a result, to win the elections in Gaza. The signers of the Oslo Agreement, what is known as the Quartet, the United States, Soviet Union, the United Nations, they wanted Hamas, because they won the elections, to abide by all of the agreements that had been reached with the Palestine Authority. Now, these agreements, we know, have really retarded the drive to freedom. And so Hamas said, no, we can't accept these things. And so Hamas, when they said these are unfair agreements, we cannot accept them all, the issue between the Palestine Authority, which was controlled largely by Fatah, and Hamas fought each other, and Hamas won the struggle within Gaza. As a result, Israel declares Gaza a closed territory, a hostile territory, impose a total isolation, a blockade upon Gaza, air, sea. There was an airport that was built near Rafah, but that was totally destroyed. The port was the limitation on fishing. All these kinds of restrictions were imposed on Gaza, and those restrictions continued and continue, of course, until today. In November 4th, 2008, there was supposed to be a separation of forces, but indeed Israel raided Deir al-Balah in November 2008, which was considered a violation of the truce. And that, of course, eventually would lead to an exchange of fire between rocket fire into Israel, and Israel would bomb. They have the air bombardment from the air, from the sea, from the land. And indeed, the negotiations were unsuccessful. Israel invaded that with a pattern that will be repeated in the following invasions. That is, they start with bombing from the air and the sea, and eventually the ground forces would come in. And this is the first invasion of Gaza, called the Massacre of Gaza, and about 1,400 Palestinians were killed and only 13 Israelis died. So Israel always says that Hamas hides behind civilians as an excuse to bomb and hit everything. They hit hospitals, they hit schools, they hit all kinds of infrastructure, so water facilities, etc. And basically, it's an attack on the Palestinian population. And so Israel would use occasions for its own interest to hit at the Palestinians. And as I mentioned, they were very much, there were repeated invasions that the Israelis came to call this mowing the lawn. So the second invasion of Gaza took place in 14 November 2012. Remember now, Israel had imposed a total blockade on Gaza. Nothing coming in, nothing coming out, no movement. And so the part of excuses that Israel uses is that the fishermen of Gaza were going exceeding the limits that Israelis would allow, and so indeed they would attack the fishermen. 18 boats were confiscated, 42 men were arrested, and eventually this will begin to threaten the food supply and employment and livelihood of Gazans. And so about 1,200 Gazans are going to be left without employment, without bringing this kind of essential food, because, as I mentioned, the blockade was being total. And unfortunately, Egypt was cooperating with this blockade. So eventually this would lead to cross-border firing, and a top leader of Hamas Ahmed al-Jabari was assassinated in 14 November. And that, of course, was a signal that they will invade because Hamas is bound to respond. And indeed, the same pattern is repeated again with the air, navy, and the ground troops participating in invading the Gaza Strip. This invasion, second invasion, would last 8 days, and hundreds of casualties would be the result of that. The third invasion took place in 2014. Now, after the second invasion, there was some quiet, but the insistence that we need to solve the issue, national unity government wanted to restart the negotiations for peace, and therefore you need also to bring in the people who are in Gaza. Of course, Netanyahu, that's his modus operandi. He does not want to negotiate for peace or negotiate for a settlement of the issue. And that happened. That so happened that there were 3 teenagers who were abducted in the West Bank, and that was an excuse to storm cities and places in the West Bank, as well as in mostly in West Bank. And so 300 Palestinians and all Hamas leaders in the West Bank were arrested. 369 incursions altogether in the looking for those who were abducted. 11 killed, 51 wounded. These kind of incursions that has been going on today in the West Bank, like in the Jenin refugee camp, Tul Karim, and many other places, Ramallah. So Hamas responded to this provocation by firing rockets and subsequent bombardments by the Israelis. And eventually they invaded by July 8th, which lasted 50 days. Once again, the usual pattern. This, of course, the casualties will always mount. Eventually, the Great March of Return is put on by the Gazans. This is by the border fence, and this allowed Israel to use sniper fire to kill and injure 7,000 live ammunition injuries, and were done in 1 year, 31,000 casualties, 277 deaths. This led also to another invasion, the 4th invasion of Gaza in 2021, 6 May to 21 May. This was specifically because Sheikh Jarrah, a neighborhood in Jerusalem, was going to be ethnically cleansed, and they bombarded once again the Gaza with the real horrendous results. So the 5th invasion that is ongoing, 129 days, 130 days already, it's ongoing. Hundreds of thousands are displaced now, 1.5 million nearly displaced into Rafah. The destruction is almost complete in terms of the north. This is, I had written this earlier, but now it's 29,000 people have been killed. 12,000 children have been killed. Great many are still missing, nearly 50,000 or more injuries. There is the catastrophe is going to increase because Israel continues to bomb, and now they're bombing Rafah, where all of the people who had been forced to evacuate from the north had gone into. And indeed, a catastrophe is in the making. And I am sorry to end at this particular point because it is a catastrophic situation that we are faced with, and it seems that there is no end in sight. I know this is 8 o'clock, so if this is a time allotted to me, and I'm sorry to end at this particular sour note, but I'm sure the resistance, you can see that in social media, the Gazans are steadfast, and they are really, despite the suffering, they have their heads high, and indeed they are inspiring the rest of the world by their resistance. I should stop.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud, for this intense and a deep dive into some of the history of Gaza. I personally want to thank you on my personal behalf as a Palestinian, as someone who was born in Gaza. And why this lecture is so critical, even though I grew up knowing my history, since this genocide started, I wanted to learn more, and I went to do research. And I found out that a lot of the information that when you Google Gaza, a lot of the information and a lot of the history is written in a very twisted approach. You go to Wikipedia, for example, and you find a long page about Gaza and about Palestine, and it is always from an approach and a narrative that I can see that is not ours. And this is why it is, for me personally, and my hope for those who are in attendance and listening, and in the future will be watching this this presentation and all your lectures, is to really get the information and get the history from an authentic source. The history that we get and people get on Google is not necessarily the right history. It is important that people read authentic books, listen to authentic historians, professors, so that they get the true facts and they get our side of the story, not necessarily the side that is dictated on us from those who actually have power and have control over all the social media and the internet and all these search engines. I'd like to ask you a question. I need your input on it, because when I read books, when I read the history, it's always Gaza. Gaza is even mentioned in the Bible. Yet, everything that nowadays is, when we talk about Gaza, it is Gaza Strip. And Gaza Strip didn't exist before 1948. And in 1948, when the Arab-Israeli war ended, and Israel continued its ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, many who were forced and expelled, some went to Lebanon. Lebanon took them in. Some went to Syria. Syria took them in. Some went to Jordan, and Jordan took them in. The rest, who were expelled and pushed down to Gaza, Egypt closed its borders, like they're doing now. They closed their borders. But Israel decided, okay, we're going to expel everybody who we don't want to this, square that they created and called the Gaza Strip. And that's why eventually UNRWA was created, so that UNRWA would take care of those Palestinians who became refugees in their own homeland, those who were expelled from Palestine after the 1948 war ended. Your thoughts?
My thoughts on that, indeed, that Gaza Strip is a very small portion of the area of southern Palestine, where Gaza would be, actually at one point, Gaza was the capital of Palestine. So it's not just, this little strip. And so Gaza, during the Mamluk period, for example, was the seat of the sub-governor And the area of Gaza would include all the way to Jaffa, and as a matter of fact, at certain times included the Lud and Ramla. And if you look at the earlier map of Palestine, basically, this is a Sykes-Picot, right? And this is when I mentioned how Palestine came into being. All this region, Beit Jibrin, for example, was part of Gaza. Beit Jibrin is right now in the areas of Al Khalil. And so the natural extension of Gaza was actually beyond this line that separates Jordan from Palestine, Wadi Araba, into, as I mentioned, Petra, which is over right here. So this particular territory was, so we're not talking about Gaza as a center, had many localities around it, and it was, again, from all of the descriptions that I read in Arab geographers of the Middle Ages, it was always prosperous, had a great deal of agricultural hinterland, and indeed, so the strip is an artificial creation that was basically negotiated in the armistice agreement between the Egyptian forces and the Israeli forces in 1948. So that's, you know, if that's what I know about Gaza, in the sense that it is really a huge area that had been reduced and squeezed by the failure of the Egyptian forces in 1948 because of the various factors that I mentioned. And so it is indeed, even this small territory, still the Israelis want to take it. And one of the reasons for this onslaught and the destruction that is taking place is to make Gaza uninhabitable for its own inhabitants so that they can take it over. This is one of the same issues that they have done in other areas in the West Bank, I mean, in Palestine, when most of the people were driven out, they destroyed these villages. Now, nearly 525 villages were destroyed, according to another map that I showed earlier, that indeed, there's the onslaught. The onslaught is continuous. And so all of these people, villages in here, were pushed into Gaza. And in Bir Saba and others were pushed into Gaza and created that artificial boundary for their own interests, for their own, for their own purposes. So this is, so Gaza as a, it is really, to me, it's the symbol, has become the symbol of resistance, especially since 1988 and with the first Intifada, and continues to shine a bright light as to what people can do, and all of that they have achieved, they build, and all of that with all of the restrictions being imposed upon them by the Israeli and Egyptian governments.
Thank you again, Dr. Mahmoud. I appreciate your explanation. And again, this is an invitation for everyone who is interested that Google is not the source for history. History needs to be taken from history books, authentic history books, and authentic professors of history like yourself. We are grateful that you gave us of your time and your knowledge. There was definitely interest. There was a request that you would give that series about Islamic history. I will definitely pass this to our committee, a programming committee, and perhaps after Ramadan, we can schedule and organize such a series. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. May Allah bless you, and grateful for all those who were in attendance. And may Allah end this genocide in Gaza and give freedom, peace, and comfort to the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine. Thank you all.
Amen.
May Allah bless you, and have a blessed evening.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you very much.
Dr. Mahmood Ibrahim and Sister Hadab Tarifi. And if anyone missed the sessions that we had previously on the history of Palestine, you can find them, and you can find this video as well, inshallah, on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much again, and may Allah bless all of you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.